Good evening and welcome to the Womxn Show. I'm Lanina Rasool. Tonight we're speaking about gender-based violence and sexual assault within religious institutions and religious communities. Now there have been a spate of disclosures, public disclosures, accusing powerful men within religious communities of sexual assault. Tonight we're going to be speaking to Reverend June Dolley, who is a reverend within the Anglican Church of Southern Africa, and Faatin Bux, who is a survivor of sexual assault from Cape Town, as they are taking on religious institutions and powerful men to say that this is not okay. We'll be speaking about what it means to break the silence, what it means to accuse powerful men, and most especially the responses from religious institutions when these disclosures arise. But before that, let's have a look at some of the disclosures which have arisen over the past few months. Welcome back. You're still watching the Womxn Show. And tonight we're speaking about gender-based violence within religious institutions. And we're looking specifically at sexual assault, how it's handled, how, whether the justice system is involved, and just how religious institutions and I think religious stakeholders respond to sexual assault. And with me in studio is Faatin Bux, who is a victor, she calls herself, and survivor from Cape Town. Yeah. And via Zoom, we have Reverend June Dolley from the Anglican Church of South Africa. Welcome, Reverend.
Thank you.
So, Faatin and Reverend June, we are, going to go into this conversation, and I'm just going to start because you both are survivors. You both are victors. And Faatin, your experience, I'm going to start with you because you did a Facebook Live video recently, and within that video, you disclosed that you had been a victim of sexual assault many, many years ago. In fact, your first experience. And within that, had said that you did not disclose when it happened. So I think I'm just going to start the conversation asking about why you felt that you could not disclose for so long, just from your perspective as a woman, and I think also just within the context of the community.
Okay, so I grew up in a very conservative home, as modern as my family has been over time. And when I say modern, I mean my mum has always been pro-education, so has my dad, and they've tried to expose us to the world in a way that obviously makes sense for where we're living now, but ultimately still very conservative within the Muslim community in the Western Cape specifically. I cite the Western Cape because we're very different from the Muslim community, say, in Johannesburg or Port Elizabeth. There are nuances there. So in the Western Cape, I suspect a little bit more cliquey and a lot more conservative and sometimes largely judgmental of sexual violence or anything that may be sexual in nature, it's an uncomfortable thing to speak about. I mean, in my home, as much as my mum is a modern woman, it wasn't really something as simple as calling a vagina a vagina.
Yes. Well,
not,
I mean,
not
same.
done,
Yeah,
you know?
in most households, I think, in the cultures that we have today.
Absolutely. So you don't speak about it. I mean, I speak about it freely now with my girls, much to my mother's, like, she's mortified some of the time with the amount of detail I share with my own children. But I grew up in a conservative family, loving conservative family. And the night that I got raped, or the day that I got raped, I was 21 years old, and I wasn't supposed to be with a man. I wasn't supposed to be alone with him. And because I was alone with him, and because that in and of itself was a shameful thing to do, I didn't speak about it. Because how was I going to expect mom and dad to understand that despite the fact that I've disobeyed them and I was alone with him, he had sex with me without my permission? How was I now going to rally their support for me when I put myself, in my mind at that time, I put myself in a position to be violated? And that was the narrative I was coming from at the age of 21. And so I can well understand how other young ladies, even now, would sort of have that conversation with themselves and just go, maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just gonna hold it to myself. And I kept it quiet for 8 years. I mean, I literally, when I got married, about a year and a half later, I told my now ex-husband something along the lines of me being promiscuous, around me giving a guy a blowjob. And so, you know, that's how I managed to get the STD that I now have because of that rape. So all of those things I held close, and I kept myself accountable, and I didn't hold anybody else. I didn't pull any of them into the story. The only time I came out with it then was when I got divorced, and my father just went, darling, like, what happened, you know?
Yeah.
Like, what happened? Because I raised you a certain way, and how has your life now come to this? Because also divorce, there's a stigma attached to it.
Yes.
And then I call it draining the swamp. I just like, bleh, and I told my father everything. And then he understood, and he was surprised that I didn't, like, why didn't you tell me? My mom too, like, why didn't you tell me? And yet, funnily enough, if you speak to my mom and sister now, because my father's since passed on, we still haven't actually sat down like you and I now.
Yeah.
As candidly as I'm speaking to you about it, I actually haven't sat with the two of them now that I'm thinking about it. And it's not because they're shaming me or that we don't know the story and we still keep it hush. I've been far too vocal about it over the past, 9 years. But still, it's not like we're having a family discussion and mom has said, babe, tell me about that day, you know?
And I think that, you know, you bring up an important thing because even though we are being more vocal about it, it is still, and sex is still not something that we talk about. And so...
I mean, I don't know about Reverend June's experience, but like a Muslim woman, a good Muslim woman, shock horror that you should even be enjoying sex or openly speaking about your enjoyment of sex and your sexuality. So now imagine that space then being violated by a man who has sex with you without your consent. Like, the shame really does deepen, you know, it grows roots and it silences us.
No, exactly. I'm going to come to Reverend June. You were also assaulted and you were raped actually within the institution. And you did disclose. And so can you tell us a little bit about, you know, what kicked in after your assault and after your disclosure, and especially within the religious institution?
Well, once again, thank you for having me. And because it was a mainline church, it is a mainline church, the Anglican Church of Southern Africa, I was told right from the start to be silent. At first, I kept quiet and I was going to college the next year. So I listened to the persons who told me to be quiet. But when I disclosed to my bishop, I was just newly ordained as a deacon. That was And he had told me that, reminded me of the fact that I've taken a vow of canonical obedience towards my bishop, which means I have to obey what he says. So being freshly ordained as a deacon, a transitional deacon, your bishop telling you that you have to keep quiet because you've taken these vows, and telling me that I need to consider my perpetrator's family, his wife. Their daughter was just killed a year prior to that. So telling me to consider all these things, but above all, I need to protect the name of the Anglican Church of Southern Africa. And so I did that because you basically do it out of fear. And just as Faatin had shared, you know, the shame that goes with it. Up until today, I constantly wash hands. I'm constantly washing myself as if that filth you just cannot take it away from you. So having being raped by a priest within such a massive institution was quite hard, because it's my word against that of his. It's my word against an institution. So my bishop chose not to stand by me. He chose the side of the perpetrator to protect the name of the church. And in so doing, who do you believe? The woman, or do you believe such an institution? Do you believe the bishop? So the bishop would say, no, she's crazy, she's making up stuff, she's got problems with men. And so I was literally silenced for all those years. But I had to physically break the fear before I could break the silence. And it's so easy for people to say break the silence, but you literally caught up in fear, and sex is taboo. You just don't speak about it in our culture, in our time, and especially not within the bounds of the church. It's just something you do not discuss. And so it's been tough. And up until today, it's been years. And only in 2018, when a known author came forward and he broke the silence, did the church actually start the safer and inclusive church commissions. And only after 2 hunger strikes for myself this year in September, did the church finally admit publicly and say that they confess that they're complicit towards gender-based violence within the church, and that clergy in the past have protected the perpetrator and sided with the perpetrator. However, that does not change the issue about what has happened to me. They are still quiet. The perpetrator still continues to minister. So it's been a tough journey because you are literally silenced, and it's within this institution that's so mighty. Patriarchy that's at the root of all gender-based violence. I truly believe that. And so having to stand up against such an institution, a patriarchal institution, a religious institution, it's quite hard.
Thank you, June, for Reverend June, for sharing your story. And I think that you raise such an important point, because I myself often have issues with the term break the silence. Yeah. And I believe that we should speak about it, but I don't feel like there is protection for victims and survivors after they break the silence. And I almost wonder, you know, about the secondary traumatization after the silence is broken, if the system and institutions involved do not protect the victim and do not work to hold the perpetrator accountable. I just want to go into the fact that we've been seeing an increase in public disclosures. And I think there's been a particular focus on disclosures within the Muslim community, Faatin, because I think you were saying it's so conservative, it's so hidden, and I think, as Reverend June said, it was discouraged because of who the perpetrators are, especially if they are sort of people in power. And within the Muslim community, we are seeing within the teaching sector, you know, there have been 2 principals who are now in their 80s been called out by their own granddaughter. There's another case that was the reason that you actually did the Facebook Live video. Yes. So can you tell us a little bit about that, and also how that pushed you to take this on?
So often as a Facebook warrior, you know, you come across stories that you either get triggered by or somehow it resonates with you. And this particular story about the Hafiz teacher, so just recently my father left me with a beautiful legacy of personalizing Qurans and making them. So I've latched on to the recitation of the Quran, and have my interest in the Quran has grown. And as a result, obviously, was approaching Hafiz schools in order to pass the message on, or just sort of market what it is that I'm currently doing. But then simultaneously, one young lady then popped into my inbox, as they would ordinarily, and I've had several of those over the years, because as vocal as I am on Facebook in my private capacity, obviously then there are women who say, can you please help us with this, that and the other. And I've also helped several divorcees along the way, because I've been quite vocal about my own divorce. Either way, that's a long story. The bottom line is I latched on to this particular story and was then asked to help. And I was told that there's been silence around the issues for about the past year, and the family was frustrated by the lack of movement in the case, despite the fact that the young girl, she's a minor, has come forward to now obviously speak against the principle of a recitation of the Quran school. They call them Hafid schools. So Abdul Karim Davids is his name. And so obviously in this instance, I'm going, this doesn't fit with my understanding of what the Quran teaches. It doesn't fit with my understanding of what our Prophet has taught around, the status of women in Islam, etc., etc. And so there's this huge schism happening inside of me, and obviously my own story resonates. But then because I've also had experienced trauma with, for example, the Muslim Judicial Council when it came to my own divorce years ago. And so I'm going and looking at this and going, there's something majorly wrong with this case, particularly since it's in such an incredibly holy space where the Quran is at its center. I mean, this is literally a school where kids are taught to memorize the Quran, boys and girls. And so if you're going, so it becomes truth, tradition, beliefs, culture, they all start sort of filters that start getting added to this case. And I'm going, can we just cut through to the truth of it, to the heart of it, which is the Quran? And so then you've got a principal and a teacher who, incidentally, Abdul Karim Davids has got a history. He taught at a previous Hafid school. He was somehow asked to resign or removed from that school. He then went on to foster his own school. So if you can understand, he has got a history within our community. And we always say, all Muslims, we're kind of cousins, we all know one another, and in Cape Town particularly so. So in my, if I were to call out an institution, I will go straight to the Muslim Judicial Council and I'll go, how did you not know? Unless he's part of some kind of brotherhood that I've got no understanding of.
And just to confirm, in terms of sort of starting his own school, that would have to be sanctioned by the Muslim Judicial Council.
Well, I'm not sure if it's necessarily sanctioned, but they would have known of it. And if you check the Muslim Judicial Council website, you'll see all the schools are listed. So it becomes, it's part of an area that they sort of oversee or know of. And if you're going to be speaking in mosques to communities and subsequently families and individuals, then this is an area that you are aware of. And so if he had a reputation at the previous school, he took that same behavior, that same human, went and started a school of his own. And so how did we not think that it was going to be problematic? And yet, there is still silence around it. If we take a look at the Emirate principals, for example, those twins who were called out, they were at a public school. And I'm asking myself, I haven't myself seen anything from the education department. That was Trafalgar High School they taught at. So where's the education department in all of this? What have they actually said around two prolific principals within their midst for years and years having taught, and they didn't call them out? So it's the same with the MJC. These big structures, these big bodies that hold power, and sometimes coercive power, power that is corrupt. And then we give them this power by virtue of the fact that they should know better. And these are men. So I often think of the MJC as my father's friends. So my dad passed on at 60, so they're all in that age group, 60 plus, possibly younger. Abdul Karim Davids is younger, so he would be more my age, and I've just turned 40. So if you understand how at that age you're keeping quiet and you're not saying anything about your sons after you and their bad behavior, then chances are your bad behavior is what caused the bad behavior in the Abdul Karim Davidsons of the world. So the moment Abdul Karim Davids is outed and we don't speak about him, we keep that story quiet, it means that I too can still be quiet about potentially things that I've done. And
it contributes to what we've been calling a culture of silence.
It is a culture. It is a culture of silence. And on Friday, I was a little bit of more chutzpah than I thought I would have around, particularly the president of the Muslim Judicial Council. I don't follow the imams and sheikhs much. I mean, most of them I would roll my eyes at, you know. I mean, you can look at me, I'm not the typical hijabi. But there's a nickname for him, they call him Finnagafani. There's a reason for that. Not only verbally is he quite fast and doesn't always think before he speaks, but he's known for his temper. So how does the president of the Muslim Judicial Council not get called out for his temper in public? There have been protests where he's just gone rampant. And we kind of got to go, oh, just keep it quiet. You know, we know he's like that. Don't say anything. Really? So your peers are now making it okay for you to rampantly behave in a destructive way inside our mosques and outside.
And I think that speaks to what Reverend June was saying in terms of not just like the institutions, but also the stakeholders and I don't want to say the value and the power that is given to specific individuals that dictates sort of how they are treated or how their behavior is excused. And so and Reverend June, would you agree with that? Having been, I mean, that was the specific reason given for you not to speak out.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's toxic power, and even so, and I can fully identify what Faatin is sharing with the president of the NJC, the same with the Archbishop of the Anglican Church of Southern Africa and Metropolitan, in the fact that for decades, literally decades, they knew about it. Boys were raped for decades. Women were raped and abused, and there was this conspiracy of silence. And because it's such a massive institution, and you know the Anglican Church was at the forefront of fighting against apartheid, because of the reputation that they had, no one goes up against them. And so we're caught up in this toxic power, complete power. And if you as an Anglican priest go to the CCMA, you are told that you cannot sue God, you're employed by God, you cannot sue God. And so they hold on to the fact that you are employed by God, you cannot sue God, so they can get away with just about anything and everything. And the fact that I took them on and I would not be silenced, they made an example out of me. They literally, like if you have a marriage that's abusive, you know, the husband cripples you financially, that's exactly what the church did to me. They financially crippled me. They made it impossible for me to find work. Which literally left me out on the streets, physically on the streets. So this is what they do, complete power, which goes so contrary to the word of God in Christianity, in Islam, in Judaism. It goes completely against the word of God. But yet that's what they do, complete power unto themselves, and they do not care who they destroy in the process. And so breaking the silence, breaking the fear and breaking the silence is a hard thing to do because exactly what they do to you. You are left like a leper in years gone by on the outskirts, and you're completely ousted. You're seen as an outsider, and then you have those faithful Anglicans that is just so faithful to the institution that they will side and they internalize it, and I call, even women do that, and we call them the handmaidens of patriarchy. And that's just the reality of what is happening when you take on an institution, and especially a religious institution who has to speak out about, you'd expect them to be the voice of integrity and a safe space. And now that is no longer safe space. So
yes,
yeah, it becomes quite hard.
Reverend, thank you. We need to take a quick break. but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we are speaking about gender-based violence in religious institutions and communities. With me in studio is Faatin Bux, who is a survivor of sexual violence. And we've got Reverend June Dolley, who is also a survivor of sexual violence, and has reported her assault that happened within the Anglican Church of South Africa. And Reverend, I just want to come back to you again, because we were speaking about sort of the culture of silence, and we were speaking about sort of perpetrators, powerful perpetrators, if we want to call it that, and how just their position in the church is used to silence us. And I was wondering whether you can just like unpack that as a survivor, as someone who was silenced, as a woman who was told, don't report this, because you will ruin someone else's life. Can you tell us what that felt like and what that said to you and communicated to you about your worth, about your role in the church, about the sort of not acknowledging the assault and the effect of that assault on you?
That definitely had a very bad impact on me, because at the end of the day, it came across as if I had absolutely no worth within the church, and that my bishop and the institution, whom I love so much, did not even consider me. And the fact that I had to consider his family, what about my family, what about myself? And you know, when you are raped, it's a lifetime sentence. You get the nightmares, you are triggered by certain smells, by certain things that just trigger you so much. So to me, it felt like I had no worth, that he made me feel exactly what society says, you know, the victim blaming and the body shaming makes you feel as if you are guilty, and you feel that you are carrying some kind of shame. That I had to come to the point where I had to say, it's not my shame, it is his shame. He had to consider his wife, he had to consider his family, he had to consider the church before he decided to do this violent thing to me. And it was violent, it was vicious. So to me, it said a lot, and you even saw. And so for years, it was covered up in silence, where it was myself and the bishop and the institution telling me certain things and telling me to keep quiet. But no one would believe that. And so eventually on the 9th of August, Women's Day, when we had the panty demonstration outside Bishop's Court, a well-known clergy person who publicly then vilified me, and it triggered me when he said that the church would just tell me to go to hell, and that I'm diabolical and satanic as well as my followers. And that really triggered me, but looking back, I could say that it was a blessing in disguise, because that is exactly how the church, the institution, treated me for years and years, but it was done silently. So it was my word against theirs, and always making it look as if you are making it up. So when he, a known person, made those statements publicly, that was just a form of vindication for me, even though, because so many other victims are vilified, body shamed, and so they are too afraid to break the fear and break the silence. So because it's such an institution, and a religious institution, a place of sacredness, a place of sanctity, a place of safety, so yeah, it was quite hard breaking that silence. And as I said, when you break that silence, they come at you with everything that they have, which makes it very difficult for others to come forward and break the silence. As I said, there's been hundreds of boys who are now men who have been raped, but too afraid to take on this institution because they will cripple you.
Thank you, Reverend Faatin. I want to come back to you and just, you spoke earlier when we started about being a nice Muslim girl. A good Muslim girl. And we know that, so on the one hand, it's don't ruin someone else's life. On the other hand, as girls are not expected to, have anything to do with sex, really,
No.
but procreate in some way.
Yes.
But I wanted to ask you, within the context of that experience, being raised to be a good girl, which most girls are. I mean, we're all accustomed to that narrative, we must be good. I needed to be a lot more good, better than my brothers.
More quiet.
Exactly, more
little bit more
quiet, don't make a lot of
docile.
trouble,
Yes.
etc. All of those things.
Yeah.
What does it say to you, and then to be involved with this experience now, where this behavior is excused within the community, where this behavior is allowed to go on, but we still must not ruin men's lives. What does that say to you about, do you think, the institution's understanding, if any, about sexual assault, about gender-based violence, and about how the role of women is viewed within these cultures?
So I often think of, so if I were to go back to the MJC, I often see them as a bunch of fish in a fishbowl. They don't quite see the water. No fish does. So that's their context. And so it's a context of, we shouldn't really be talking about these horrible things, because part of our Prophet's teachings was that you don't, if somebody does something ugly, you don't amplify the ugliness. Okay, you deal with it, but that doesn't mean you don't deal with it, but you don't amplify it. But how it's been misconstrued over the years is, in not amplifying it and not shining a spotlight on it, it has been kept quiet, it has been muted. And that is a teaching that most of these men, my father's friends, would hold dear. Moenie daaroor praat nie. Vee het onder die mat in. Because, and that's the behavior it ends up perpetuating, because you're not supposed to amplify the ugliness. You're supposed to highlight the good and the best in people. And so that amounts to this misconstruing of what our Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's actual teachings were. Because at the same time, he revered women. He put them on a pedestal. So how does this not amplifying what these evil men have done, but you have to elevate women and their status anyway? So there's like this, it's a paradox within leadership that they themselves don't understand. And then their behavior sort of emulates that misunderstanding of what their roles should be. So what we expect, and when you talk about gender sensitivity within the MJC, I mean, come on, how many prayer meetings, Muslim prayer meetings have I attended over the years where the women are literally in the kitchen. They are literally, like, vrouens moenie so, sê vir die vrouens op en hulle moenie so geraas maak nie, ons is besig hier. I mean, that kind of like indoctrination that says we, the understanders of Quran, the ones who teach you lowly folk who don't understand, we have an elevated status, a self-appointed elevated status. It's not even as if the community have said, oh wow, we'd like that imam and that imam and that imam over there for their illustrious career to sit on the council that is the MJC. These are self-appointed masters of the universe. I mean, do you get the degree to which this BS perpetuates all the way from the top, all the way to the little boy who now sits in the Madari and recites his Quran, and then that same Hafid principal touches his leg and sodomizes him. My mind boggles. It doesn't make any sense. And then we need to then unpack this thing about breaking of the silence. You put the onus on the victors, the survivors, like Reverend June and I, and yet the silent dominant group are the men. Not just as the perpetrators like Abdul Karim Davids, but then also as the victims. You know, we don't know the amount of little boys that have been touched and sodomized. Because again, just like there is silence amongst their abusive ways and the perpetrators, there's also a lot of silence around little boys who are now men, who are now very protective of their little girls. And you ask yourself, why? You know? And then, sadly, the women, the handmaidens of patriarchy, like Reverend June said, who insist that that system must hold.
Yes.
You know, so I often curiously look at the women, the wives of the masters of the MJC. And I think to myself, what's going on? What's happening inside your home with your sons and your daughters? And then this sort of flimsily developed Muslim women section of the Muslim Judicial Council, where, where the women's voices must be heard. But those aunties are largely the partners of the masters. So how do you now get a different view?
Yes.
And the young women like myself who are now, raging against this machine, we are silenced. Julle weet nie waarvan julle praat nie. Kyk hoe lyk jy. I can
Uphold
imagine.
the status quo, yes.
I mean, I can imagine a lot of Muslim men and women watching this show now going, maar sy dra nie eens 'n doekie. How dare she speak up? Because they've got a listening for me that says you're not qualified because where is your hijab? How dare you? And yet I will readily say I'm a sinner like everybody else, just like you.
So that's interesting because you're again speaking, we're speaking about value,
Yeah,
right? Allocated
Yes.
within gender, but also within structures and
Yeah.
power. And what I'm also hearing is, a sense of democracy,
Yes.
which is what we need. Which
Yes.
we need in religion also. It's traditionally never been there. I was also raised growing up in the church, and that was just the way it was. All the men are priests.
Yes.
Women are not allowed to do that. And I will just say, for me, which was perhaps the beginning of an eye-opener for me, was women were not allowed to wear pants in church. So we were just not allowed, and then that's just because.
Yes.
Actually, what they used to say is because we have respect for God's house, and this is why women have to wear skirts. But when I was about 15,
Yeah.
the powers that be decided that it is now okay.
So it's not disrespectful anymore.
Yes.
Okay.
And so for me, at the time, I was like, but who made that decision? And does that mean that now we can disrespect?
Yes.
I'm using logic. I'm using my 15-year-old logic.
Yes.
But what we are speaking about is disrupting a system and disrupting religious systems. And so Reverend June, I want to ask you about, what are your thoughts on that as a reverend, but also within the context as a woman?
Well, that was the code of modesty that was installed by patriarchy within the church. A woman or a girl have to dress a certain way. And that kind of fed into rape culture because that's where the body shaming come from. But did you see how she was dressed? The skirt was too short, her breasts were exposed, her arms were exposed. And so all of that stems from this religious institutions eventually feeds into patriarchy, which feeds into rape culture. And so the code of modesty, if a woman falls pregnant, the woman is put in the bench of punishment, which in Afrikaans they call the strafbank, and she's exposed for everyone to see, but the man who impregnated her, he walks free, and he's not exposed. The whole virginity testing, only the women gets done and the men are not done. And so all these things happen within this culture of religion, and yet it is these very same men who portray to be very pious on the outside, of these are the ones that are raping and sodomizing and molesting the women and the boys. And that just gets swept under the carpet because we just do not speak about that. And so we are told that 1 in 3 women are raped or sexually molested in her lifetime. We are told 1 in 4 men are rapists. But it's quite strange that we all seem to know a victim, but we don't seem to know a perpetrator. And they're there. They are one of us. They are within these religious institutions, and they're hiding behind being men of the cloth or men of God, but that is not what they are. And so, yes, we see what we get taught within religious institutions with regards to women, and these laws are made by men with regards to women, and it just filters down into society. And as I said, it feeds within rape culture, and it feeds within how we treat women, just the way we raise our girls compared to how we raise our boys. We say tigers don't cry, girls must act and sit a certain way and be submissive to the man. So when he becomes abusive, you just have to keep quiet because that's the right Christian thing to do, that's the right Muslim thing to do. And so So we feed into it and we allow society and women internalize it as well, and they become these handmaidens of patriarchy, and they then enforce it also. So yeah, within religion, sadly, a lot has to change within religion before we can even start addressing the wider issue in society, because it goes back to our religious backgrounds.
Yeah. Reverend, thank you so much for that. And before I come to, us possibly looking at what needs to change, I do want to ask you, as someone who has now reported the assault, and even as someone who reported the assault within the church many years ago, South Africa, and I think in many countries around the world, we have a very low conviction rate, and those are women who do report. The Medical Research Council a few years ago did an analysis, and they found our conviction rate at like 8% when it's compared to how many reports of sexual assault are made. And so sometimes I wonder about, so what is the point of reporting if it's, the likelihood of it resulting in a conviction is so low? What is the point of going through all of that trauma? What is the point of breaking silence in a system in which the system doesn't work? But you still went forward, even many years later, and you were reported this year. And so I just want to hear from you your perspective on breaking the silence, on reporting, on, on that in general.
It was tough, and I'm not going to lie, it is hard breaking the silence. It is hard reporting the matter to the police, because, and I've taken a lot of other women who have also gone and I've been with them, and literally, if it is someone of high standing or someone who's just got a job, they will tell you even already accepts, listen, he's employed, he's got a family that he's providing for, he's a first-time offender, so nothing's going to come of it. So already accepts when you report the matter, you already stopped and you decide, listen, it's no use going on with this. And then they tell you if you do take it further, the chances are it will be thrown out of court for various reasons. So then already they stop you. In my case, I reported it a few years back. The NPA threw it out. I was told there was no reason given. I went back in October month to reopen my case in Makanda, which is Grahamstown. And I did it for various reasons. Number one, I needed to go back into that system because I need to experience what others are also experiencing and identify the loopholes within the system. So when I came to Makanda, they told me a different story. And so basically what happens if you are a victim or a survivor of rape and you report it, the first person you tell when you've been raped becomes the witness, as according to South African law, that becomes your witness. And if your witness is too afraid to testify for various reasons, maybe fear for their life, and in my case, the institution who has crippled me and they're too afraid to be crippled in the same way, your case gets thrown out because the victim is too afraid to testify. If you are a victim and you are under the age of 6, you're too young to testify, it gets thrown out, which is feeding ground for pedophiles. So my fight right now is, why can the survivor, the victim, not be his or her own witness? So it's a tough journey. I'm still on that journey. It's not easy. It's really hard breaking the silence. It's hard reporting the matter. And because the conviction rate is so low, and I'm sorry to say that the perpetrator has more rights than you as a victim. It comes across like that because you are told, and they will forever remain a first-time offender because you are stopped from reporting the matter, and if you get stopped from taking it further. So even though they've raped many times before, they will always, in the eyes of the law, be a first-time offender. So it is hard, and I will not lie, but please break that fear. If we all unite together and we stand up against the system and we fight for justice, we can make a difference.
Thank you, Reverend. I just want to shift to looking at possibly, what we would like to see. What is the change that we want to see? But and again, as survivors, as women, as mothers, and we're speaking about, power structures. What is the changes that we need to see?
So as a blanket rule, believe the victim. Let's start there. No victim shaming, none of the drama that comes with actually breaking the silence, because when they finally, like Reverend June and I finally now do start speaking, don't now go and character assassinate or try and somehow find a loophole. I've been called all kinds of things, from pathological liar all the way to like she must be crazy. You know, that she's just far too vocal for us. I'm too uncomfortable for my tribe. Mm-hmm. And so more and more women are coming to speak, believe the victim. Mm-hmm. And then I'm also aware that there are obviously cases where false accusations are made. That will come out in a broken system. It will. It's inevitable that will come out in a broken system. But the system is so broken to begin with that even the victims who are advancing the cause, so the more cases come out, the more the loopholes in the system can be exposed. Mm-hmm. From the magistrates who treat you like crap in their courtrooms, to the clerks who hide your files. You would have heard me say on my live feed, I literally watched the clerk get up from her desk because I finally lost it. And she went to go and find my file behind a bookshelf in the clerk's office. That kind of craziness needs to get exposed. And that clerk right there needs to be asked, what the hell just happened?
And needs to be investigated. And
Exactly.
I often also say that in a system that works, the system needs to work for everyone.
Yes.
So if everybody is very worried about the small percentage, as has been calculated, of false accusations,
Yes.
what would happen in a system that was fixed is that if investigated properly,
It would get picked up.
it would expose the false investigations. And so that works for everyone.
Yes.
We need to take a short break, but we're going to come back and just hear from Reverend June, closing remarks from Reverend June after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show. We've been discussing gender-based violence in religious institutions and communities. And before we go, we're going to just hear some parting words from Reverend June Dolley, who is a reverend in the Anglican Church of South Africa. And Reverend, just to bring back the question again, it was what needs to change?
I think we need to change the narrative when it comes to the victim survivor. We need to believe the victim. And for the victim also, you need to believe yourself. You need to realize it's not your shame, but it is the shame of the perpetrator. And so often the victim is caught up in a cycle of pain and nightmares and hurt and do not move beyond that. And to the victim, I think that what needs to change is take your power back, because your perpetrator still has that power over you. You need to be able to move from the pain to power. Yes, we remember what has happened to us, but let it not have power over us. Let the perpetrator no longer have power over us. Take it back. And to society, we need to stop victim blaming, stop body shaming, believe the victim, stop enabling the perpetrator. And it starts with each one of us. If we each speak up and speak out, we can make a difference.
Thank you, Reverend. That was Reverend June Dolley from the Anglican Church of South Africa. And thank you, Faatin, also for joining us. That's all we have for this evening. Thank you for joining us. Good night.